There comes a moment when a human being looks in the mirror and realizes that their life isn't exactly in ruins, but out of alignment. Nothing seems dramatically wrong, and yet everything feels out of place. The body moves, but the soul doesn't keep up. It's at this silent, almost imperceptible point that true chaos begins, the kind no one sees, but which corrodes from the inside out. And this is where I ask you a question. Have you been living an organized life, or just a life sustained by appearances? Carl Jung said that most people don't live their own lives. They live the image they have of themselves. And it is this image, constructed like armor, that often becomes the most subtle prison of existence. Organizing life in this context has nothing to do with schedules, productivity methods, or successful routines. It has to do with an intimate gesture, a return to what is true within you, even if it requires the collapse of everything that seemed solid. The first revolution of the soul is not noisy. It begins in silence, when the individual realizes that the noise of the world is, in fact, the echo of their own internal disarray. When Jung spoke of the unconscious, he was not referring to something mystical or distant, but to a living, autonomous dimension that acts all the time beneath the surface of consciousness. And it is there that the disorder that manifests itself outside resides, in causeless fatigue, in repetitive relationships, in postponed promises, in choices that sound right but produce emptiness. How many times have you tried to get your life in order? How many lists have you written? How many goals have you set? How many times have you sworn that now it's going to happen? But what happens next? The initial impulse fades, the motivation evaporates, and you return to feeling that same old noise, the muffled sound of a soul trying to communicate with a distracted mind. Jung believed that the human psyche is self-regulating. It seeks balance, even when it seems to be collapsing. Therefore, when disorder sets in, it is never an accident. It is a signal, a request from the unconscious for something to be looked at, recognized, brought to light. But most people ignore this call. Instead of plunging into their own chaos, they choose to combat it with even more noise, more tasks, more goals, more movement. And the more you run away, the more you get lost. Genuine organization is born not from control, but from listening. It is not the disciplined mind that reorganizes the being, but the attentive heart. While the world teaches that stability comes from external order, Jung shows us that it is born from inner reconciliation. A mind can be full of plans and yet remain in disarray. A life can seem stable and, internally, be a pure labyrinth. External chaos is merely a metaphor for what remains unresolved within ourselves. And here's the trap. We believe that changing circumstances will change destiny. But destiny, as Jung said, is the name we give to the unconscious when it is not understood. Life repeats itself not because the world conspires against us, but because we conspire against what we don't want to see. There is a type of suffering that is repetition, and there is another one which is purification. The first one binds you, the second one sets you free. Organizing life means accepting to get through the second. Imagine for a moment that your life was an old house. You can paint it, decorate the rooms, rearrange the furniture, but if the foundations are cracked, nothing will hold up. The dust you sweep under the rug of consciousness remains there, accumulating, hiding truths that will one day return as symptoms, crises, collapses. This is what Jung called return of the repressed. That which you reject in yourself returns disguised, demanding to be acknowledged. That's why the real work of organizing begins where the ordinary eye can't reach. Not in the closet, but in the mind. Not on the agenda, but in the soul. Not in terms of timing, but in terms of intention. Organizing oneself means deciding to confront psychic disorder with brutal honesty, recognizing the paralyzing fear, the masking pride, the fragmenting desire. It's an archaeology of the spirit, a delicate and painful excavation, where each discovery reorganizes what you thought you knew about yourself. But the ego fears this journey. He wants comfort, linearity, control. Jung described it as the small circle of light that is believed to contain the whole. But the unconscious is vast, and sooner or later, the sea invades the shore. Inner organization begins when the ego recognizes its limitations, when it understands that it is not the center of life but an instrument of the self, that deeper and wiser instance that constantly tries to lead us back to wholeness. The self, Jung said, is the silent architect who works in the shadows of the psyche. It does not seek efficiency, but wholeness. And to achieve that wholeness, one must descend, not ascend. Descending into the unconscious is the opposite of social ascension. It's a dive into forgotten zones, into the pains that shaped our structure, into the voids we try to fill with distractions. It is there and only there that chaos begins to reorganize itself in form and meaning. Have you ever noticed how the people who most strive to prove their balance are often the most unstable? How come those who talk about happiness all the time seem to be running away from it? This is the contradiction that Jung called psychic compensation. The unconscious tends to generate the opposite of what the ego insists on affirming. When someone lives to appear strong, it's because they fear their own fragility. When someone lives to be admired, it's because they doubt their own worth. And when someone spends their time trying to control the world, it's because they've lost control of themselves. Organizing life, then, is not about erasing disorder. It's about understanding it. It's not about rejecting chaos. It's about giving it symbolic form. The psyche heals when it is understood, not when it is denied. Therefore, every time you resist what you feel, psychic energy accumulates like subterranean pressure. Sooner or later, it will find a way to emerge. In crises, in anxieties, in illnesses, in behaviors that you don't recognize as your own. And at that moment, the ego asks itself, why is this happening to me? But the unconscious responds, because you stopped listening to me. Jung believed that the soul speaks in symbols, not in words. It manifests itself in dreams, in intuitions, in synchronicities that defy logic. And these signs are invitations. Invitations to reorganize consciousness. Invitations to rebuild the bridge between what you think and what you are. But few people answer. Most people fear silence because silence is the most honest mirror there is. It is in this that the excesses, the lies, the burdens you carry without realizing it are revealed. And it is also there that the process of liberation begins. Jung said that no one becomes enlightened by imagining figures of light, but by making the darkness conscious. This is perhaps the most misunderstood phrase in his work, because she doesn't talk about pessimism, but about courage. Organizing your life is exactly that, to illuminate the darkness without fear of seeing what lies within. True order is the result of integration, not extermination. It's when the conflicting parties learn to talk to each other. Fear, doubt, anger, desire, all become allies in building a more complete consciousness. Chaos, then, ceases to be the villain of the story and becomes the path itself, for it is he who indicates where the light is lacking, where the soul still sleeps. That's why every transformation begins with a collapse, and every collapse is, in essence, a disguised reorganization. The psyche needs to dismantle the old in order to rebuild the new. Pain, when viewed consciously, is simply the birth of what wants to be born. But when it is denied, it turns into imprisonment. Perhaps you're experiencing this right now, that vague feeling of being out of place, of silent misalignment. It's not failure, it's a calling. It is the self whispering beneath the noise of routine. Come home, and that house is you. Not the you that the world applauds, but the one the mirror shows when no one is looking. Organizing one's own life is, therefore, an act of humility in the face of mystery. It's admitting that there's an intelligence operating beyond your control, and that resisting it is to perpetuate disorder. Jung used to say that what we resist persists, what we accept transforms. Acceptance here is not resignation, but cooperation with the psychic process. It is about trusting that, by illuminating the unconscious, life itself finds its way back to the natural order of things. But beware, true order is neither linear nor predictable. It pulsates, moves, breathes. It rebuilds itself at every moment, like the flow of a river that never passes through the same point twice. Organizing oneself is learning to dance with this movement, without rigidity, without escapism. It's about being present in the chaos, and yet remaining centered. Jung left us a map but not a path, because everyone needs to forge their own path. And that's the scariest and most liberating part of all. No one can tell you how to organize your life. Only you can listen to what it's trying to tell you. Ultimately, everything we call order is an attempt to translate the invisible harmony that already exists within us. When you align yourself with it, the world around you seems to change. But the world is the same. It was you who changed your perspective, and that's where something new begins. The mind stops reacting and starts responding. Decisions cease to be defenses and become expressions. Daily life ceases to be repetitive and becomes ritual. Routine becomes a bridge. Life, once scattered, begins to revolve around a center that has always been there, forgotten but never absent. This is the point at which the organization ceases to be technical and becomes inner calling, and whoever listens to this calling is inevitably transformed. For the silence that once frightened becomes the place where the soul breathes. But before we move on, there's one last question you need to ask yourself. If everything that happens outside is a reflection of what happens inside, what is your life trying to show you right now? Perhaps the answer lies precisely where you least want to look, and it is there, in that forgotten territory, in that internal noise that you avoid, that true organization begins. That's where individuation takes its first step, and that's where the story really begins. There comes a point in life when we realize that external answers no longer suffice. The formulas, the methods, the motivational speeches, nothing seems to penetrate the deepest layer of being. It's as if something inside us is saying, enough. And from that point on, what once made sense begins to lose its color. Friends, goals, habits, even work itself, everything seems to fade away. Not because the world has changed, but because you changed. Even though I don't know how to explain it. Carl Jung called this phenomenon the beginning of the individuation process, the point at which a human being stops living according to what the world expects of them and begins to seek what the soul silently asks for. Most people try to resist this movement. They feel the discomfort of the change and interpret it as weakness. They force themselves to return to their routine, try to recapture old enthusiasms, and pretend that everything is fine. But the soul is patient and relentless. She doesn't accept substitutes. She is not content with what is false. And when the ego insists on maintaining control, the unconscious finds ways to make itself heard, through dreams, crises, symptoms, coincidences, or that inexplicable feeling of emptiness, even when everything seems right. Jung used to say that individuation is the most difficult and most necessary of human tasks. Difficult because it requires the courage to look into one's own abyss. Necessary because everything that is avoided early in life returns in the middle of it, demanding integration. And this request doesn't come as a gentle plea, but as a psychological earthquake. It dismantles the persona you created to survive. Think for a moment about how many times you've made choices to fit in, to please others, or to be accepted. Perhaps she pursued a profession she didn't love, simply because it seemed secure. Perhaps she stayed in a relationship where there was no longer any truth, only fear of starting over. Or perhaps they have become functionally happy, the kind of person who does everything right, but feels an inner weariness they can't name. This weariness, Jung would say, is the soul trying to emerge. The self, that deeper, more all-encompassing instance of the psyche, begins to move, pushing the ego out of its comfort zone. And the more the ego resists, the more life seems to lose its meaning. The path to individuation is therefore a kind of controlled disorganization. Before the new can emerge, the old must crumble. The person you believed yourself to be begins to crumble, not out of weakness, but because the structure that supported that self no longer serves its purpose. Jung said that no one becomes enlightened by imagining figures of light, but by making the darkness conscious. And that's exactly what this process is. Confronting the inner darkness, not to destroy it, but to understand what it's trying to teach. Jung once wrote in a letter that the human soul is like an ancient forest. There is light and shadow, life and decay, and only those who are willing to walk all its paths can truly know themselves. The ego, however, prefers clearings. He fears the dark parts, the repressed feelings, the unconfessed impulses, the contradictions. But it is precisely in these hidden zones that psychological gold is concealed. Jung called this gold of the shadow, the potential trapped in the parts we deny. Imagine, for example, a woman who has spent her life trying to be perfect, a good daughter, a good professional, a good mother, a good friend. She performs all her roles excellently, but is constantly exhausted. One night she dreams that she is locked inside a burning house and cannot get out. This dream, according to Jung, is not just fantasy, it is a symbol. The house represents the constructed self, the character. Fire represents accumulated psychic energy, the impulse for liberation, and the fact that she's trapped shows what the ego feels in the face of change. Fear. She wakes up startled, but something inside her awakens. She realizes she needs to let the fire do its work. She needs to open a door, even if it means disrupting everything that seemed safe. It is at this moment that the individuation process begins. Individuation is not a linear process. It moves in spirals. As the individual progresses, the psyche presents new challenges, new contradictions to be integrated. And each time something is understood, a part of the shadow becomes light. Jung saw this as a kind of dance between the conscious and unconscious, a living dialogue between opposing forces that, when balanced, produce meaning. But this process doesn't only happen in doctors' offices or during silent meditations. It manifests itself in everyday life, in the small situations that test our consistency, when you have to choose between comfort and truth, when someone offends you and instead of reacting, you observe what that awakens in you, when you feel anger, envy, jealousy, and instead of suppressing it, you choose to understand. These are the moments when the unconscious communicates. Life, then, ceases to be a sequence of random events and becomes a symbolic language, a narrative that speaks from the inside out. Jung said that what does not come to consciousness returns as fate. This means that everything we avoid looking at ends up materializing in reality, demanding to be experienced in some way. If you ignore your aggression, it will manifest in someone close to you who provokes you. If you deny your desire, it returns as an obsession. If you suppress your pain, it transforms into coldness. Therefore, individuation is an act of reconciliation. She does not seek to eliminate conflict, but to integrate it, to recognize that light and shadow coexist, and that wholeness arises from the encounter between the two. Jung once told the story of a patient named Henry, a successful businessman who suffered from panic attacks with no apparent cause. Analysis revealed that he had repressed an artistic desire for decades. As a child, he dreamed of painting, but his father, strict and pragmatic, convinced him that art was a waste of time. Henry grew into an exemplary adult, but the price was high. His suffocated soul began to react. Panic attacks were the unconscious trying to release trapped creative energy. Upon returning to painting, Henry not only reduced his symptoms but also rediscovered a sense of purpose that his career had never given him. This is the essence of individuation, the return to what is authentic, even if the world doesn't understand. The process of becoming who you are, as Jung defined it, involves abandoning imposed identities and reclaiming your deepest calling. But this requires a commitment that the ego resists making, because being authentic means losing certain privileges, easy recognition, the comfort of conformity, the applause of others. Individuation, therefore, comes at a price, conscious solitude, not the loneliness of isolation, but the kind that arises when you realize that the inner path is unique and cannot be transferred. No one can walk for you. No one can fully understand what goes on in their soul. And yet, it is in this sacred isolation that true companionship is born, the encounter with the self. According to Jung, the self is the organizing center of the psyche, the axis around which everything revolves. When the individual distances himself from it, life loses its coherence. But when things start to fall into place, even the difficulties make sense. It's as if the whole of existence begins to obey an invisible rhythm, and each experience, however painful, becomes part of a greater order. Jung believed that this movement is not optional. It is a necessity of the soul. Human beings can postpone their individuation, but they cannot avoid it. Sooner or later, life will lead you back to your own center, whether through love or through pain. There is a passage in Jung's diaries in which he recounts a symbolic dream. He was descending a stone staircase that led him to an underground cave. Deep inside that cave, there was a flame that never went out. He later understood that this flame was the self, the unchanging spark of the soul, the source of meaning that survives all masks. And it is this image that defines the heart of individuation, the descent into the inner cave itself. There, the individual confronts their fears, their desires, their history, and in doing so, is reborn more authentic. But not everyone gets there. Many give up halfway through, preferring the comfortable surface of the persona, the social role, the forced smile, the functional life. Others confuse individuation with rebellion, and end up at the opposite extreme. They reject everything but build nothing. Jung warned of this risk. That which we deny externally without integrating internally becomes just another kind of dependency. In other words, denying the old self is not enough. It needs to be transformed. Individuation is not a rupture, it is a transmutation. The ego is not destroyed, it is educated. He ceases to be a tyrant and becomes a servant of the whole. And this process is, above all, pedagogical. Life teaches through repetition until we understand the lesson. Now imagine you're on a road and suddenly realize you've taken the wrong turn. Most people try to speed up, as if speed could compensate for the wrong direction. Individuation is the opposite. It's the moment when you stop the car, look at the map, and humbly admit that you need to go back a few kilometers. This pause, this recognition, is the beginning of a true reorganization of life. When Jung spoke of living the symbol, he was referring to this capacity to understand the hidden meaning in events. Nothing is random. Loss, mistakes, failures, everything can contain a message from the unconscious. Life doesn't speak in prose, it speaks in metaphors. And those who learn to decipher them begin to realize that each experience, however painful, is a step in their own inner construction. Perhaps you know someone who went through a major crisis and, after it, was never the same again. Sometimes it's the loss of a loved one, the failure of a business, an illness, or burnout. These events, though devastating, function as rites of passage, symbolic doors that open when the old self can no longer contain the growth of the soul. It's as if existence were saying, the time has come to grow up. And maturity, in Jungian terminology, is another name for individuation. Jung observed that modern humans suffer not only from overwork or anxiety, but also from lack of sense. And meaning cannot be bought, it is built. It is born when the individual aligns with the self and lives according to their inner truth. That's why many feel empty even after achieving everything they desired. The ego accomplished its plans, but the soul remained hungry. When life begins to sound like a voiceless echo, it's a sign that individuation is calling. This calling does not come from outside. It is not announced clearly. It seeps into the cracks of everyday life, into a recurring dream, a persistent discomfort, an improbable coincidence. Those who learn to listen to these signals begin to realize that the unconscious is not an enemy, but an ally, and that behind the apparent chaos there is an ordering intelligence guiding the being towards a point of equilibrium. Organizing one's own life in this sense is much more than solving problems. It's about building a bridge between what you see and what you feel. It is allowing the invisible to guide the visible. It is learning to read one's own existence as if it were a symbolic text in which each line carries a unique and personal message. And this learning process doesn't end there. Jung said that individuation is an unfinished work, a lifelong process, because the soul is never exhausted in a single form. What you call a crisis may simply be the soul shedding its skin. What you call loss may be liberation from something that no longer made sense. And what you call confusion may simply be the transition between two ways of being, the old, which is dying, and the new, which has not yet been born. But here's the paradox. The more you try to hasten the birth, the more it retracts. The soul has its own time, and the self operates in silence. There is no manual. There are no shortcuts. There is only listening. And those who truly listen realize that there is a hidden order, even amidst the chaos. Life always knew what it was doing, and perhaps that's the biggest surprise. Realizing that individuation, despite being painful, is a process of love. A love that doesn't come from the outside, but from within. The love of someone who finally decides to be whole. And whoever becomes whole inevitably reorganizes the world around them. Because the world is nothing more than a reflection of the psyche that perceives it. And then comes the question that leads to the next stage of the journey. If chaos is the mirror of the soul, and individuation is the path to integrating it, how do you deal with chaos without getting lost in it? Perhaps the answer lies not in controlling the chaos, but in learning to read what it is trying to say. There are times when life seems to push us into uncharted territory, as if the ground beneath our feet loses its shape, and everything that once offered stability begins to dissolve. It is then that certainties crumble, plans become hazy, and the meaning of things slips through our fingers. Jung would say that at that moment the unconscious is calling. It doesn't ask permission, it invades. It reorganizes the plot, disrupts the landscape, breaks the predictable rhythm of daily life. The chaos we so fear is, in fact, a messenger. It doesn't come to destroy, it comes to reveal. But what is chaos trying to tell you right now? What if it's not an enemy but a language? Most people react to chaos by trying to erase it. They rush to quick fixes, to ready-made advice, to anything that restores the feeling of control. But control is an illusion that the ego uses to avoid facing the unknown. Chaos, from Jung's perspective, is not the absence of meaning. It is the birth of new meaning. External disorganization merely reflects an internal restructuring. When life goes off track, it's because the old track no longer serves its purpose. Imagine someone who always believed themselves to be strong, rational, and unwavering. One day, this person suffers an emotional collapse in the face of loss. Everything I knew about you ceases to function. The pain disarms the defenses, and what emerges is a fragility that the ego never allowed to exist. This moment is both terrible and liberating. Jung would say it is the unconscious breaking through the surface, bringing to light what has been repressed. Fragility is not the opposite of strength. It is the other pole necessary for it to become real. But do we know how to deal with the collapse when it comes? Or were we trained only to endure until we break? From an early age, we are taught to maintain an appearance of stability. We learn to smile when everything is falling apart, to keep going when the body screams for a pause, to feign calm while the soul begs for attention. Society values control, but Jung reminded us that the psyche cannot endure repression for long. What is denied returns with greater force. Thus, the crises we try to avoid become inevitable. Disorder doesn't arise from nothing. It is the price of prolonged silence of the soul. There is a profound difference between the natural chaos of life and the chaos manufactured by the ego. The first one comes to reorganize. The second arises from resistance to change. When the unconscious tries to manifest itself and the ego ignores it, the result is psychic tension that grows until it explodes. Anxiety, insomnia, anger, discouragement, all these are symptoms of an unresolved internal conflict. And ironically, the more we try to organize the external world to compensate, the further we move away from our true center. Chaos, in Jungian thought, is the means by which the unconscious communicates. It brings symbolic images, strange coincidences, situations that seem to repeat themselves for no apparent reason. Jung called this synchronicity, seemingly disconnected events that reflect an inner pattern. One day you think about changing your life, and on the same day you receive a message, a song, a phrase that echoes exactly that desire. It's not coincidence, it's dialogue. The external world reflects the movement of the unconscious, like a mirror that returns what has not yet been recognized. But what have you been seeing in that mirror lately? How many times has life shown you the same pattern, and you called it bad luck? Chaos is also an emotional mirror. It reflects what you can't stand in yourself. That person who irritates you may be showing you a trait you deny possessing. The recurring situation may be pointing to a lesson yet to be learned. Jung said that everything that irritates us in others can lead us to an understanding of ourselves. Therefore, running away from chaos is running away from the opportunity for integration. Every disorder is a letter sent by the shadow, the unconscious part of the personality that holds everything we reject. Some people spend their lives trying to conquer the shadow, as if it were an enemy. But whoever tries to conquer the shadow ends up being conquered by it. Because the unconscious cannot be destroyed, it transforms itself. And when the ego agrees to engage in dialogue with chaos, something changes. Fear is transformed into curiosity. Suffering ceases to be punishment and becomes language. Have you ever noticed how sometimes the greatest moments of clarity come after a great loss? It's as if the collapse opens a crack in consciousness, and through that crack, light begins to enter. Pain has this paradoxical function. It breaks down the ego's shell so that the self can breathe. For Jung, the self is the psychic totality, the union between the conscious and the unconscious. It is the silent center that observes, without judgment, the theater of life. When the ego moves away from this center, life fragments. But when it returns to it, even chaos acquires meaning. Jung said that opposing each other helps each other, because opposites in the psyche are not enemies, they are complementary. Anger reveals the limit, fear protects, sadness purifies, chaos reorganizes. Wisdom lies not in choosing a side, but in sustaining the paradox. But how can we sustain this paradox in a world that demands quick answers and absolute certainties? How can one remain whole when everything around them demands fragmentation? The truth is that the human psyche wasn't made to live in the linear way that society imposes. We are cyclical, symbolic, contradictory, and chaos is a constant reminder of this living nature. It arrives to break the rigidity of the ego, to dissolve the masks that have become suffocating. Chaos is the natural movement of life pushing the human being back to authenticity. But authenticity has a price. It demands detachment from everything that is artificial. And that's frightening, because it implies losing control, status, identity. There are people who, faced with chaos, decide to be reborn. Others prefer to hide from him. But ignoring the chaos is like covering your ears to an inner scream. Sooner or later, the call becomes too loud. What the unconscious tries to correct doesn't disappear with time. It just changes form. A woman who suppresses her anger may develop chronic anxiety. A man who denies his vulnerability may lose the ability to love. A person who avoids silence may end up drowning in the noise of their own thoughts. These are the symptoms of a life that has lost touch with its center. And paradoxically, it is chaos that brings it back. Chaos, when viewed with awareness, is medicine. It brings to light what needs to be healed. But in depth psychology, healing is not about eliminating the symptom. It's about understanding it. The symptom is the messenger. The problem is what generated it. That is why Jung always told his patients, don't try to get rid of the pain, listen to it. Pain speaks an ancient language. It reveals the exact point where the soul stopped growing. Can you remember the moment when you started to drift away from yourself? At what point in your story did you decide it was safer to pretend? Chaos always indicates this breaking point, and if you have the courage to follow it, you will find the missing thread of your own narrative. Jung viewed the unconscious as an intelligent, self-regulating system. When there is an imbalance, it produces images and experiences that push consciousness back into balance. These images can appear in dreams, coincidences, physical symptoms, or even as people who cross your path at that exact moment. Nothing happens by chance. Life uses chaos as a teaching tool. She teaches through disorder what order could never teach. But are we willing to learn through discomfort? Or will we continue trying to find safety where growth demands risk? There is a human tendency to seek rational explanations for everything. We want to understand the why of things, when true power lies in understanding the what for. Chaos comes not to punish, but to prepare. It is the symbolic process of dissolution before renewal. Just as gold needs fire, consciousness needs conflict to purify itself. And when this process is accepted, transformation is inevitable. What seemed like destruction reveals itself to be gestation. Ruins become fertile ground. The silence that once frightened becomes a home. Confusion gives way to clarity. But there's a detail that few people realize. The chaos never completely disappears. He is a part of life. The goal is not to eliminate it, but to learn how to engage with it. In Jung's inner alchemy, chaos is the raw material, the raw substance from which spiritual gold is extracted. Without chaos, there is no creation. Without shadow, there is no form. Without conflict, there is no consciousness. Chaos is the symbolic womb of the soul, dark, damp, uncomfortable, but fertile. And every time you dive into it, something within you is reborn. There is no evolution without disorder, nor healing without confrontation. Therefore, Jung asserted that the greatest act of human courage is to remain conscious amidst the confusion. Consciousness doesn't eliminate chaos, but it illuminates it. And when the light of consciousness touches the darkness ceases to be a threat and becomes a space of revelation. But what happens when you stop running away and start observing? When do you decide not to react, but to understand? Chaos changes its face. He ceases to be a monster and transforms into a master. And the master speaks through metaphors, not rules. He teaches patience, humility, and surrender. Think of the ocean. It is pure movement. Trying to control it is impossible, but learning to navigate it is an art. Chaos is that inner ocean. The more you fight against the waves, the deeper you sink. But when you learn to flow with them, you discover that there has always been a rhythm, the rhythm of the soul, the same one that guides the invisible tides of existence. Chaos is not the end of the road. It is the crossroads where the old and the new meet. He asks, do you still want to be who you were, or are you ready to become who you are? And that question changes everything, because from that point on, chaos ceases to be punishment and becomes a passage. Suffering gains purpose, collapse gains beauty, the fall gains direction. Perhaps you are at that point right now, in the midst of the storm, without understanding why everything seems to be falling apart. But remember, collapse is just life's way of repositioning you. It's the unconscious redrawing the map, and when the dust settles, you'll see that the chaos never deterred you from your path. It was the way. From here, the journey deepens, because once you understand the chaos, a new task arises, to protect the inner silence where the unconscious can continue to speak. But how do you do that in a world that never stops, that calls to you all the time, that drags you back outside? Perhaps the next step isn't to control the world, but to learn how to protect your presence within it. Because those who learn to be present even amidst the chaos discovers that true peace is not the opposite of chaos, but the awareness that runs through it. We live in an age where noise has become the new oxygen. Everything around us demands an immediate response. Notifications, conversations, appointments, sounds, lights, screens. According to a survey by Harvard University, the average person receives, on average, more than 120 notifications per day. This means being interrupted once every 12 minutes. And yet, many of us call this state normal life. What we call normality is, in fact, a collective attention disorder. Jung, if he were alive today, would probably call it hurry psychosis, a condition in which the ego, inflated by excessive stimuli, completely loses contact with the self, the silent source of the soul. How many times have you felt your mind restless, jumping from one thought to another without pause? How many times have you tried to rest, but your body rested while your mind continued racing? We live surrounded by stimuli that rob us of our most human and sacred capacity. The presence noise is not merely auditory, it is symbolic. It occupies the space where the unconscious attempts to manifest itself. Jung said that the unconscious speaks when the mind is silent. If this is true, perhaps we are collectively deaf to our own soul. Imagine for a moment a person who wakes up, picks up their cell phone and starts the day answering messages, reading the news, scrolling through videos. Before coffee, you've already gone through hundreds of micro-stories that don't belong to your life. When you finally get up, your mind is fragmented, a mosaic of other people's voices, images, and opinions. The day hasn't even begun, but your vital energy is already diluted. This isn't an individual failing, it's a symptom of a culture that transformed distraction into identity. And distraction, as Jung warned, is the most efficient way to keep the unconscious repressed. In 2015, a Microsoft study revealed that the average human attention span has fallen to 8 seconds, smaller than that of a goldfish. The fact seems comical, but it's tragic. A mind incapable of sustaining attention is also a mind incapable of self-knowledge. Attention is the portal through which the unconscious sends its messages. If the portal is permanently occupied, the soul stops speaking. And when the soul is silent, the human being becomes an automaton, functional but empty. But what would happen if you were silent for a few minutes? What would emerge if the noise suddenly stopped? Jung said that the self doesn't shout, it whispers. And to hear a whisper, you need to slow down. However, slowing down is seen today as weakness. Resting has become a luxury. Being offline is almost an act of rebellion. And paradoxically, the more connected we are to the world, the more disconnected we are from ourselves. Silence has become unbearable, because in it we are forced to confront what we try to avoid: loneliness, emptiness, doubt, shadow. An experiment conducted by the University of Virginia showed that 67% of people would rather receive small electric shocks than remain in absolute silence for 15 minutes. Think about it. Most people prefer physical pain to encountering themselves. Jung would say that this is proof that modern human beings have become strangers within their own psyche. We have lost our inner home, that symbolic space where the self dwells. And when we lose our home, we seek refuge in noises, people, distractions, and addictions that simulate belonging but only deepen the emptiness. But what if silence wasn't absence, but rather presence? What if there was something inside it that had been waiting for you for a long time? Jung viewed silence as fertile ground. He believed that when the conscious mind quiets down, the unconscious finds space to emerge with images, symbols, and intuitions. It is in silence that the soul reorganizes itself. Modern thought, however, associates silence with passivity. We are conditioned to believe that doing is always more important than being. But while doing belongs to the ego, being belongs to the self, and the self, to manifest itself, needs space. Ancient wisdom, present in Eastern traditions and also in Jung's symbolic psychology, points to the same principle: quietude. It is the point of contact between the human and the transcendent. Silence is the womb where new forms of consciousness are born. It is the uterus of the symbol, the territory where the invisible begins to take shape. When you withdraw, when you interrupt the chaotic flow of the mind and simply observe, the unconscious begins to send you coded messages, more vivid dreams, coincidences, sudden inspirations, unexpected insights. A curious example: Jung reported that many of his patients had recurring dreams involving houses, labyrinths, forests, and oceans. These spaces, he said, represent the unconscious trying to reorganize itself. When someone dreams of a messy house, the symbol reflects an internal state of psychic disorganization. When they dream of cleaning that house, the unconscious shows that the healing process has begun. The mind, when silent, begins to rebuild itself through images. The unconscious speaks in metaphors, and silence is the translator. But how do you create silence in a world that never stops? How can we listen to our soul amidst the avalanche of stimuli? The answer lies in what Jung called inner discipline. It's not about cutting off the world, but about changing how you are in it. It's possible to live connected without being captured. It's possible to be present at work, in relationships, on social media, and still maintain a sacred space where the self breathes. This requires daily choices: turning off your phone during coffee, walking without headphones, breathing before responding, being fully present in a conversation. Small gestures that reclaim control of your attention. Jung believed that where your attention is, there your psychic energy is. If your attention is scattered, your energy will be scattered too, and a mind without energy has no depth, only surface. Recent neuroscience research confirms what Jung intuited. Scientists at MIT observed that periods of silence stimulate neurogenesis, the birth of new brain cells in the hippocampus, a region associated with memory and learning. In other words, silence literally repairs the brain. Constant noise, on the other hand, increases cortisol levels, the stress hormone, and causes mental fatigue. What Jung saw as a symbolic truth, the restorative power of stillness, is now proven by science. But do we really want to heal the mind? Or have we become accustomed to living tired, distracted, confused, as long as it keeps us busy enough not to feel? Distraction is comfortable because it prevents confrontation with what is real. It's easier to look at a screen than to look inward. Silence, on the other hand, is dangerous. It reflects back the mirror, and that mirror shows the distance between who you are and who you appear to be. That's why the ego fears withdrawal so much. It knows that, in silence, it loses its throne. The self doesn't need a stage, it needs presence. And presence is the most revolutionary state that exists in a world obsessed with performance. Jung said that modern civilization is in danger because it has lost contact with the symbolic sources of the soul. These sources can only be accessed at depth, and depth does not reside in noise. She lives in pause, the moment you decide not to react, in the breath between one thought and another. That moment when, instead of running, you simply stop and observe. The pause is the portal, and what lies on the other side of the pause is the self. A striking example comes from Jung's life. For years, he himself lived under the weight of intellect and fame. After distancing himself from Freud, he plunged into a period of intense inner turmoil. Instead of seeking answers in theory, he decided to listen to the unconscious. He spent hours drawing mandalas, recording dreams, and conversing with himself in silence. From that immersion was born the Red Book. This is perhaps his most enigmatic work. In it, Jung describes how, by silencing reason, he was led into a direct dialogue with the symbolic images of his soul. He wrote, "I had to accept that what the mind rejects may be the key to its own healing." For Jung, silence was the laboratory of transformation. But what would happen if each of us had the courage to create our own inner laboratory? What if, Instead of searching for answers outside ourselves, we decided to listen to what our unconscious is trying to tell us. Today, we live as if the value of life were measured in volume. We speak loudly, we think fast, we want a lot, but the truth is that the soul whispers. She doesn't compete with the noise. She waits. Wait for the moment when you get tired of the surface and decide to dive in. And when this immersion happens, something extraordinary is revealed. Calmness is not the absence of movement. It is movement with meaning. Silence is not emptiness. It is fullness. It doesn't isolate you. It reconnects you. It's not a waste of time. It's a gain in reality. True productivity arises from the space between one thought and another, the space where the self breathes and reorganizes the psyche. In a world that demands constant reaction, choosing to remain silent is an act of power. It's a way of saying, I decide what enters my mind. I decide what deserves my energy. This decision is the first step towards true inner freedom, because what we don't control with our attention controls us through distraction. Jung said that attention is a bridge between the ego and the unconscious. When you focus with presence, that bridge stabilizes. But when attention wanders, the unconscious becomes blocked, and the result is confusion. Therefore, it all begins with the simple act of choosing what deserves your presence. It's not about isolation, but about curation of the soul. Choosing what enters your mind is choosing who you become. Perhaps you still believe you don't have time to be silent. But the question is another one. How much of your life have you missed out on by not doing this? How many thoughtless decisions? How many superficial relationships? How many wasted opportunities simply because your mind was too noisy to perceive what was essential? Silence is not a luxury for the few. It is a necessity for everyone. And the more noise there is in the world, the more indispensable it becomes. Silence is the antidote of the 21st century. It is the invisible remedy that cures burnout, anxiety, and alienation. But to take it, you need courage. The courage not to respond immediately. The courage to say, I don't know. The courage to feel what is truly happening inside you. Because it is only when the noise ceases that the truth begins to emerge. And here is the final paradox. Silence does not eliminate chaos. It reveals it in detail. He doesn't rid you of confusion, but he teaches you to listen to it until it translates into wisdom. Silence doesn't promise peace. It offers truth. And the truth, when accepted, is the beginning of all peace. Now stop for a moment. Breathe. Listen to the ambient sound. Observe the mind that tries to fill the void. Notice the urge to do something again. That impulse is the ego. The one who observes silently is the self. And it is between one and the other that their whole life unfolds. Perhaps it's time to start choosing which of the two you want to live in. Because silence, more than the absence of sound, is the presence of being. And whoever learns to listen to it discovers something that no noise can reveal. That within the deepest silence of the soul, there is a voice. And that voice always knew the way back home. There is an invisible boundary that separates health from exhaustion, love from submission, care from self-annihilation. It is a thin, almost imperceptible line that many cross without realizing it, and the price of crossing it is high. Loss of energy, clarity, and identity. Jung said that, whatever the ego does not delimit, the world invades. This is perhaps one of the most forgotten laws of psychic life. When we don't know where we end up, we become hostages to the expectations, demands, and desires of others. We live in a time when saying yes has become a virtue and saying no is seen as selfishness. But no is the invisible muscle of the soul. It defines the space where the self can breathe. Without it, the individual dissolves into the collective and loses contact with their own truth. The absence of limits is, therefore, a subtle form of self-denial, and the more we try to please the world, the further we move away from our center. Have you ever noticed how the most tired people are almost always the most available? How those who never say no are the ones who get sick the most? This is not a coincidence. It's a consequence. The body screams what the mouth doesn't say, and when the psyche feels invaded, the body reacts. Jung observed that many emotional illnesses are symbolic symptoms of broken boundaries. The mind says yes, but the soul tries to defend itself by saying, enough. But why is it so difficult to draw boundaries? Why are we so afraid of disappointing? The answer lies at the root of our upbringing. From an early age, we learn that being accepted is more important than being authentic. that pleasing others is safer than asserting oneself, and that yielding is the only way to guarantee love. This is the legacy of childhood, the conditioning that no generates rejection. And the unconscious, faithful to its original learning, continues to repeat the pattern in adulthood. Jung called this the parental complex, the internalized voices that shape our automatic responses. Even as adults, we continue trying to satisfy invisible parents. A man who works himself to the limit, unable to rest, may be trying to prove something his father never acknowledged. A woman who accepts toxic relationships may be reliving the fear of losing love that, in childhood, was conditional on obedience. These behaviors are not weaknesses. They are unconscious repetitions. The absence of boundaries is not a lack of strength, but a lack of awareness of one's own worth. Jung said that the ego, when not properly structured, seeks outside what it should find within. It is the permeable ego, vulnerable to approval, criticism, and the gaze of others. It lives for the sake of reflection, not substance. And reflection is volatile. Today you are admired, tomorrow you are forgotten. The immature ego cannot bear the silence of indifference. It feeds on recognition, even if it costs its peace. But what would happen if you stopped seeking approval? Who would you be without the pressure of trying to please others? This is the kind of question the unconscious loves, because it opens a crack in the persona, the social mask we use to function. Jung said that the persona is necessary, but dangerous when it becomes identity. We need it to live in society, but when we believe we are only that persona, we lose touch with our soul. The persona is the role. The self is the actor. And every actor needs, at some point, to leave the stage to remember who they are. When we live only in our persona, we confuse boundaries with rudeness. But boundaries are not about closure, they are about coherence. It is the point where the self and the other recognize each other without merging. A healthy boundary is one that preserves mutual respect and maintains balanced vital energy. Without boundaries, love transforms into servitude, and kindness becomes exhaustion. There's a symbolic story Jung used to tell in his classes. He recounted a tree growing near a wall. The tree sought the sun, but because the wall blocked the light, it began to bend, growing crooked, toward any free space it could find. Years later, when the wall was removed, the tree remained bent, unable to straighten. That's how we are. Shaped by the obstacles of childhood, we remain bent, even when there are no longer any barriers. Limits are what allow us to grow in the right direction, without deforming our essence. But how do you straighten a soul that has spent years bowed down? Where to begin again? The first step is to recognize the pattern. Every time you say yes when you want to say no, you are reaffirming the wall that imprisons you. Every time you accept someone else's burden, you are teaching the world that you can carry what is not yours. The limit begins with recognizing one's own fatigue. It's necessary to listen to the body, the mood, the silence. The psyche speaks in signals. When the limit is broken, the unconscious sends alerts. Irritation, guilt, exhaustion, resentment. These feelings, far from being flaws, are compasses. They point to where your energy has been invaded. Jung said that the soul cannot endure prolonged lies, and excessive concessions are, at their core, a lie. The lie that we can be everything to everyone. But the truth is, we can't, and we don't need to. Individuation, the process of becoming who you are, requires this discernment. Saying no is one of the purest ways to say yes to one's own integrity. There's a very common misconception that setting boundaries will push people away, but the opposite is what happens. When you define your boundaries, you attract more genuine relationships. Connections cease to be based on need and begin to be built on respect. Anyone who is offended by your boundaries has never truly connected with you, but with a version of you molded to please them. And this version sooner or later collapses. In Jung's office, there was a patient who couldn't refuse to help others. She was generous and sensitive, but she was always exhausted. One day, Jung asked her, "When you help someone, do you do it out of love or out of fear of not being loved?" The question paralyzed her. She realized that deep down, her kindness was a form of unconscious bargaining. She needed help to be accepted, and this need imprisoned her. Over time, she learned to help when she could, not when she should, and she discovered that true love doesn't require exhaustion. This story illustrates something essential. The boundary is not a wall. It is a living membrane. It allows trades, but prevents invasions. A healthy limit is flexible. It adapts without losing its shape. When the ego is strong, it knows how to filter. When it is weakened, it absorbs everything. Therefore, Jung saw the strengthening of the ego as a fundamental part of the individuation process. A mature ego is not arrogant. It is stable. He recognizes the self as the center, but also understands his role as guardian. Can you tell where your role ends and your truth begins? Can you distinguish between what is a choice and what is a reflection of fear? These are questions that build boundaries. The absence of limits is also evident in ideas. How many times have you believed in something simply because many others believed in it? How many times did he remain silent so as not to contradict the group? The collective unconscious, Jung said, exerts a powerful force on the individual. When the ego is not firm, it is dragged along by the opinion of the masses, and the result is a loss of identity. The boundary, in this case, is what separates the authentic mind from the conditioned mind. Human history shows how the absence of limits can lead to destruction. Wars, fanaticism, and extreme ideologies arise when the individual abandons their inner responsibility and merges with the collective. Jung saw in this one of the great dangers of modernity, the man who ceases to think for himself and begins to act as a reflection of the crowd. He wrote, "The greatest threat to humanity is the loss of the individual soul in the sea of the collective unconscious." That phrase still resonates today, because every time we say yes just to fit in, we are participating in this erasure. And every time we consciously say no, we are restoring the world's balance. A small act of psychic resistance. But how do you find the balance between a healthy ego and a closed ego? How can we prevent the limit from turning into isolation? The answer lies in the intention. The boundary based on fear creates division. Limits based on awareness provide protection. The first builds walls. The second constructs gates. And these portals allow love to enter without destroying us. Setting conscious boundaries is an act of mature love. It is love that says, "I see you, but I also see myself." It is love that knows it cannot offer itself entirely to someone who does not reciprocate. In a world that glorifies constant availability, setting boundaries is a revolutionary act. That is to say, I exist. It is recognizing that your energy is sacred, and that wasting it is a form of profanation. Jung called this the ethics of the self, the commitment to living in coherence with one's own soul. It's not selfishness, it's spiritual responsibility, because those who don't respect their own limits inevitably overstep the boundaries of others. Disorder begins within and spreads outward. There comes a point in the journey of individuation when the individual realizes that true control lies not in dominating the world, but in dominating oneself. And if mastering is, above all, knowing when to stop, knowing when to step back when something disrupts inner peace, knowing when to be silent when speech no longer produces truth, knowing when to let go when attachment becomes a prison. The limit is the visible form of invisible maturity. And perhaps this is one of the greatest proofs of the human soul. Keep your heart open, but your borders firm. Because to love is not to surrender without form. It is to offer presence without losing one's identity. Only those who know their own limits can love without becoming deluded. When you learn to say no, you discover something surprising. Life goes on. The world doesn't end. The people who truly matter stay. And, for the first time, what remains is what is true. Freedom begins where the fear of displeasing others ends, and self-respect is born where no is uttered without guilt. At that moment, the ego ceases to be a prisoner of the collective and becomes the guardian of the soul. The boundary transforms into a temple, and within this temple the self flourishes, in silence, in peace, in fullness. But there is still one last frontier to cross, the one that separates the conscious self from its own shadow. Because setting boundaries in the world is easy, setting them within yourself is difficult, and that's what the journey continues to be about. The encounter with the dark side, the one that dwells within one's own limitations. The next step is not to push away the darkness, but to learn to walk with it, because only when a man reconciles with his shadow does he finally become whole. There are moments when, after all the searching, all the reflection and all the pain, the soul simply sits down, silent. There is nothing left to prove, nothing left to defend. All that remains is the realization that living, in its fullest form, is an act of constant integration. between what is known and what is felt, between the visible and the invisible. It is at this point that the journey of individuation, of which Carl Jung spoke, ceases to be theory and becomes practice. The real work is not to understand, it's to embody. Throughout our lives we have been taught to accumulate information, possessions, opinions, social roles. But Jung invited us to do the opposite, reduce the excess until only the essence remains. He used to say that, whoever looks outside dreams, whoever looks inside awakens. Now, awakening doesn't happen as a sudden illumination, but as a series of small, conscious gestures, repeated until they become nature. Inner transformation isn't magic, it's a method. And this method begins with a simple yet radical choice, to take responsibility for one's own conscience. Everything that happens to you, everything that hurts or delights you, is a symbolic message from your psyche trying to show you something. The question is, are you willing to listen? Because those who truly listen discover that life was never against him. It was always the most honest reflection of his inner state. But transforming awareness into action requires strategy. Jung knew that the unconscious does not bend to the intellect. It responds to rituals, symbols, and lived experiences. Therefore, to make learning practical, it is necessary to structure habits that unite body, mind, and soul. Self-knowledge is not achieved through reading, but through conscious repetition. Below is a practical plan inspired by Jungian thought. It's not a to-do list, but a living framework, a symbolic map that you can adapt to your reality. It doesn't change the world on the outside, but it changes how you inhabit it on the inside. 1. Create a daily space for silence. Jung said that the unconscious speaks when the noise ceases. Set aside 10 to 15 minutes a day to do nothing. No music, no cell phone, no distractions. Just breathe and observe what arises. At first, it will seem useless. After a few weeks, you will begin to notice patterns, sensations, memories. This is the unconscious revealing itself. Silence is the soul's first laboratory. 2. Write down your dreams and emotions. For over 40 years, Jung recorded his own dreams and those of his patients. He saw in them the invisible blueprint for transformation. Write down every dream fragment, every recurring emotion, every symbol that haunts you. Don't interpret rationally. Observe. The unconscious communicates through images, not logic. When something repeats itself, it's because it wants to be understood. 3. Reduce unnecessary stimuli. Everything that enters the mind is transformed into psychic energy. This means that every news item, video, or conversation is either nourishment or poison. Filter what you consume. Reduce your screen time. Watch, read, and listen only to what expands you. Attention is the most precious investment of consciousness. If you waste it, you lose creative power. 4. Choose a symbolic practice. It could be writing, drawing, meditating, walking, painting, playing an instrument. The important thing is not the technique, but the state of presence that she creates. Jung called this active imagination, the dialogue between the conscious and the unconscious. It is the moment when the ego opens itself to the soul. When you engage in an activity with mindfulness, the self begins to reorganize the inner chaos into form and meaning. 5. Review your relationships and boundaries. Observe which relationships nourish you and which drain you, which environments inspire you and which numb you. Each person around you is a mirror of your psyche. If there are relationships based on guilt, fear, or obligation, ask yourself, what does this dynamic reveal about what I haven't yet healed within myself? The boundary, as we learn, is the visible outline of self-love. 6. Practice emotional discernment. Jung said that emotion is the main way of contacting the unconscious. Instead of repressing or justifying what you feel, ask yourself what the emotion is trying to teach you. Anger can indicate injustice. Sadness can indicate a loss of meaning. Anxiety can indicate disconnection. No emotion is an enemy. All are messengers. Suffering begins when you try to silence the messenger instead of listening to the message. 7. Simplify your daily routine. Organizing the external environment helps to reorganize the internal one. Start small. A drawer, a table, a room. Every act of material order is a metaphor for psychic order. Jung believed that the unconscious loves concrete symbols. Therefore, taking care of what is visible helps to heal what is invisible. 8. Create closing and beginning rituals. Every psychic change needs milestones. Before sleeping, review the day. What you learned, what still hurts, what can be left behind. Upon waking, set an intention. This cycle of closing and opening symbolizes the eternal dance between death and rebirth. Consciousness expands through symbolic repetition. 9. Face the shadow with compassion. Everything you reject continues to govern your life in the shadows. The first step is to recognize, this is also me. When you embrace your dark sides, jealousy, laziness, envy, fear, you prevent them from acting unconsciously. Jung said that the shadow is not evil. It is raw energy that has not yet been educated by consciousness. Integrating it is transforming instinct into wisdom. 10. Choose a purpose that challenges you. Individuation doesn't end with self-knowledge, but with contribution. A mature soul desires to serve. Discover something greater than yourself. A cause, a project, an art, a mission. Jung said that, without purpose, the soul becomes ill. Purpose is the axis that aligns psychic energy and gives meaning to suffering. These 10 steps are not commandments. They are keys. Each person will open different doors. The essential thing is to transform introspection into action. Because knowledge without practice is like an unexplored map, beautiful, but useless. But perhaps you're still wondering, where do I even begin when life is so chaotic? Start where it hurts. Pain is the entry point. It is there that the unconscious pulsates, asking for light. When you illuminate what you fear most, the trapped energy transforms into creative force. Start small. A moment of silence in the morning, a calm no, a pause before reacting. Each conscious gesture is a brick in building a new inner home. There is a little-known concept in Jung's works, the principle of minimum movement. He believed that when you perform even the smallest possible act of alignment, the psychic universe responds with infinite proportion. A small conscious act can reverse months of unconscious confusion. Therefore, don't wait for perfect motivation. Act on what is within your reach. Transformation begins when you commit to a single real gesture. Imagine for a moment that your life is a lake. The surface may be turbulent, but at the bottom, the water is calm. Self-knowledge doesn't change the wind, but it teaches you how to dive. Daily practice is the dive. You don't need to control the world. You need to learn how to breathe underwater. Jung said that the soul becomes real when it begins to act in the world. This means that every time you choose presence over haste, truth over appearance, awareness over habit, you materialize the soul. And that's what the world needs now. Less talk, more presence. It may seem difficult to put all this into practice, but remember, the psyche is patient. It doesn't demand perfection. It demands sincerity. Each time you commit to a small, authentic act, a silence, a notebook, an introspection, the unconscious reorganizes its forces. This is how chaos transforms into harmony, through the sum of small fidelities to one's own truth. And here's something most people ignore. The unconscious doesn't need promises, it needs consistency. Spiritual discipline is not rigidity, it is love in action. Loyalty to the soul means continuing to return, even when you get lost. It's about having patience with your own cycles, knowing that growth isn't a straight line, it's a spiral. Every fall is a return, every doubt is an invitation, every new beginning is a sign of maturity. Therefore, before concluding, I invite you to a simple exercise, perhaps the most transformative of all. Close your eyes now. Take 3 deep breaths. Feel your body. Observe the thoughts. And say silently, I choose to listen to myself. Repeat, I choose to listen to myself. This phrase is the pact with the self, the commitment to no longer abandon oneself. From that moment on, every conscious gesture is part of the soul's alchemy. Every choice made in person is psychic gold in the making. And little by little, the disorder begins to reorganize itself around its center. There is no transformation without continuity. Therefore, consider this video a starting point, not an end point. Go back to it when you forget. Reread your notes. Redo the exercises. Create a soul journal, a space to record symbols, dreams, insights, and progress. Revisit it monthly and observe the progress. This symbolic accompaniment is what Jung called dialogue with the unconscious. He transforms theory into practice, introspection into action. And above all, remember, the path is not about being perfect, it's about being whole. To be whole is to accept fear without succumbing to it, to accept the shadow without getting lost in it, to accept pain without making it your identity. To be whole is to live in balance between doing and being, between thinking and feeling, between acting and listening. Individuation is the art of keeping the heart awake amidst chaos. For every step you take toward awareness, the unconscious takes another step toward you, and when the two meet, a new kind of peace emerges, not the artificial peace of escape, but the authentic peace of presence. That is true freedom. It's not the absence of pain, it's the ability to go through it meaningfully. You are not here by chance. If you've reached this point, it's because something within you is already changing. The soul recognizes when it hears the truth, and the truth never shouts, it only whispers. She is saying now, continue. Keep observing, writing, breathing, choosing. Keep returning to the center, even if the world insists on pushing you away. Continue. Because the process you started here doesn't end with this video. It's only just beginning within you. And if at any point you doubt, remember Jung's words. There is no awakening of consciousness without pain. People will do anything to avoid their souls. But whoever looks inside awakens. Looking inward is the most revolutionary act a human being can perform. And the world needs, now more than ever, awakened people. Therefore, if this content touched you, even silently, allow it to continue living. Sign up for a channel like this video and share it with anyone you think needs to hear this message. In the comments, leave your questions, experiences, or feelings. You can do this anonymously if you prefer. This space is safe. It's a circle for reflection and collective growth. Here, each story helps another soul to recognize itself. And may you, upon finishing this video, take away not just words, but the silent decision to become who you always were, the whole being who patiently awaited the moment to return to the light. Now take a deep breath and begin. The alchemy of your soul has already begun.